Chapter 8. A Warning from a Fish and a Bird. Tomas put a rope through the gills of his fine grouper and swam with it out along the reef. He dived, and using a double knot, tied the fish to a rock. Even at low tide the grouper would still be under water. He wanted to keep it fresh until he was ready to fillet it and take it home firm-fleshed and sweet to his mother. Since Ramon and Miguel would be back any time now, Tomas gave up the idea of searching for his shark and decided to catch a spiny lobster, his grandmother's favorite food, for her for Christmas. He walked along the beach to the rocky bluff at the south end of the cove and slipped into the water. Climbing down the cliff, hand under hand, he peered into crevices and caves where the long tentacled delicacies lived. A chocolate-brown annelid, a tube-like sea worm with a red crown of thorns and white tentacles, pulsated below him. It was one of hundreds of species of sea worms in the Sea of Cortez that attached themselves to the rocks by using small disc-like suckers. The mestizos did not eat them, but Tomas was sure something did. Every living thing in the sea was eaten by some other living thing, he had observed. If they were too big, like the sharks and the whales, then the tiny things got them, parasites and worms. Tomas touched the sea worm. A fountain of water shot out of its tube-like body, and the odd-looking beast collapsed, virtually disappearing. Tomas held on to his breath and went on down the wall. The worm sucked in the sea and again stood tall. The column of water inside it acted as a very ingenious skeleton that could be ejected in a crisis. After checking all the lobster hideouts he knew about, and finding none of the occupants at home, Tomas spiraled slowly to the surface, watching the colors and the lights. No lobsters today, he thought, and swam home across the cove, looking down on the seafloor as an eagle looks down on the land. Before him the sand rolled with the currents, and fish swam like dream persons. Out of Tomas's line of vision the huge shark swam fitfully, thrashed and glided back to the rock reef. Suddenly the reef-side water swirled in a vortex. Tomas lifted his head and glanced curiously in the direction of the vortex, unaware that his grouper had just been eaten. He splashed up onto the beach. Down on the rocks of the reef, where the grouper had been tied, bits of shattered fish sank to the bottom. A red snapper fry swallowed 2 bites, then darted to cover in the stony cave when a grebe came after it. The frightened red snapper dropped a bite and it sank into the seaweed. Out of the seaweed emerged a pistol shrimp that had smelled the fish. It seized its tail and shot upon it like a bullet, grabbing the morsel in its one huge claw. The action was noted by a 2-spotted octopus in a crevice overhead. The octopus had 4 eyes, 2 real, 2 false. While its true eyes focused on the shrimp, the false eyes scared off competition from above. The octopus dropped like a sock filled with stones, enveloped the shrimp and morsel in its sucker-covered arms, and ate. Tomas walked up the beach and sat down on the warm sand. He put his chin in his hands and his elbows on his knees and pondered. The fight with the big grouper had changed his plans. He knew he would never be able to spear and land a shark. I think I'd better snag it from the top of the reef, he thought. To do that, I'll need Ramon's big shark hook and a strong nylon line. Once I have him snagged, I'll use a reef rock as pulley and winch him up. That ought to work. A wave rolled in carrying a dead grebe toward shore. Tomas waited and picked it up. Its breast was riddled with a line of deep holes. He turned it over. No wounds appeared to be on the back. Shark, he said. Of all fishes, only the shark can hit with the lower jaw alone, since its jaws operate separately. A blow from one jaw, though often deadly, is relatively mild. If both jaws had come into play, there would have been no bird, just blood and scraps. Tomas studied the wound. The tooth marks were almost 2 inches deep. Big, he said, and looked out across the turquoise blue sea. This bird had been hit by a large toothed shark, a tiger or hammerhead. He squinted at the shallows and wondered if it could mean that the big sharks were returning to the Torres' fishing grounds. It must be so, he said to himself, a smile brightening his face. I'll tell Ramon and Miguel. This is good news. They won't have to go so far to fish. Tomas carried the bird to the top of a sand dune and put it down. Walking back to the palapa, he sat down to watch the inevitable. The sky was sea blue with a scattering of powdery clouds. There were no birds flying overhead. Hardly had he wrapped his arms around his knees, then a vulture appeared high above the grebe. Tomas shook his head. He could never comprehend the magic of the vultures. Almost instantly and from great distances they found the dead. The scavenger was invisible one moment, then soaring across the carcass the next. How vultures knew mystified Tomas. He could understand how Aguila, the sea eagle, saw fish from great heights. They, after all, were alive and moving. But what did the vulture see? Death? Stillness? Rocks were still, and they did not circle them. Did they smell the dead? Did it have an odor even a few minutes after life left it? Tomas hoped to find out some day. He regularly laid the dead on the dune, watching and trying to discover what told a vulture death had occurred. The answer was still elusive. Yet his own senses were as keen for what he was trained to see as the vulture's. He stood up and looked out to sea. A sharp ripple had caught his eye. It was a strange boat, a chunky white inboard. Oficiales, he said, and hoped not. People of authority frightened him. Nevertheless, he rehearsed his greeting and smiled. The boat entered the cove and slowed down. Tomas could hear the men discussing something, perhaps that there were no boats on the beach, only the rowboat that sat high and dry near the dune, or perhaps they were saying they did not see anyone to talk to. Tomas was sitting back under the palapa porch in the dark shadows. He held his breath. The motor accelerated, and the boat cut a wide arc, then sped north. As Tomas blew a sigh of relief, his attention was distracted by the reef. It was very dark, nearly purple at the end of the dike, as if a cloud were casting a shadow. He glanced up. There was no cloud. Tomas shook his head and rubbed his eyes. He was seeing things. The oficiales had made him nervous. He looked around for something to do to occupy his mind and saw that the salt bucket was almost empty. Picking up a large chunk of the salt that Miguel had purchased at the Carmen Island salt mine, he smashed it with a hammer and stuffed the pieces into the rusty salt grinder that was screwed to a heavy wooden cable spool. Energetically he turned the crank. By the time he had filled half a bucket, he had pushed the oficiales out of his mind and replaced them with the visions of hooking his shark. He felt better. When the bucket was full, he carried it up to the dike to the plateau where the fish were drying and re-salted and turned them. The shark fins, which brought such good prices, were almost dry enough to be sold. He spread them far apart, hoping they would dry more quickly, and went on with his daydreaming. Then, he said to himself, I will pull the shark in slowly and steadily, bracing against the rocks until I have exhausted the mammoth. But he did not go on. A boat came around the far end of the cove and pushed up onto the beach. Zorro! Jesus! Tomas called and ran down the beach to greet them. Tomas, Zorro said briskly, have the oficiales been here? He was standing on the bow of his boat, his fur coat flapping like the wings of the manta ray. I saw an official-looking boat, said Tomas, but it didn't come ashore. It went north. Zorro's eyes bored into Tomas's, the black pupils in the yellow irises drilling like jewelers' tools. It went north? Zorro drew his lips across the tips of his sharp, uneven teeth and smiled a tricky smile. They are from the fisheries department, he said. Tomas said closer. What are they doing? They are checking nets, gill nets. Gill nets? Tomas said. Gee whiz. All the fishermen of Laredo use gill nets, with the exception of Victorio and the sports fishermen, who use rods and reels. Some nets had finer meshes than others, and each fisherman had his own preference. A few used mesh so fine they caught the baby tunas, marlin, and yellowjacks as well as the big ones. Zorro was one of these. Ramon was not. He used a large mesh, for he knew that catching the young fish was foolish. It endangered tomorrow's catch. Do you think they are banning the fine gill nets? Tomas asked. I've heard they don't like them. Zorro shrugged. Who knows? I'm not afraid of oficiales. With a jerk of his head, he signaled Jesus to push off, then stepped over a net with mesh so fine a needlefish could scarcely have gotten through it. They are not going to stop me, he said. I'll play the fox and the chicken. They go north, I go south. They go south, I go north. He laughed at the prospects of a chase. Jesus chuckled and looked up at Tomas. I'm glad we don't have a fish camp like you do, he said, gesturing to the palapa, nets, tables, anchors, and cooking utensils. We can keep moving. You're stable. You're going to get caught. Jesus threw the motor into gear and drove off, and Zorro, standing on the bow, pulled his ragged coat across his bare chest. But we don't have fine gill nets, Tomas shouted, unheard, so we don't have to run. At the end of the reef, Zorro leaned over and stared into the water as intently as a great blue heron. Jesus looked back at Tomas and waved goodbye. Jesus was a year older than Tomas and was already an experienced fisherman. He had not gone to high school. The day that school was over last June, he had walked out the door into the hot sunshine and, standing legs apart, had thrown his school book, Ciencias Sociales Tres, up in the air. He had stridden off, not looking back to see where it had fallen, or even if it had struck someone as it fell. Head up, Jesus had walked toward the sea. Adios, Jose Marti, he had called out. Adios, Fidel Castro, and also all the presidents of Mexico. I don't have to read about any of you anymore. I'm going to be a fisherman. His exit had been grand. His shoulders had been squared, and the wind had cooperated by sweeping his hair back like a genuine national hero carved out of stone. His stride had been manly. Even in Tomas's finest dreams, he was not able to carry the whale shark with the poetry of movement displayed by this young man. Nor did chickens fly up at Tomas's feet, dust rise, and dogs bark, as they had when Jesus had gone to sea. Tomas shoved his hands into his pants pockets. I guess I should be a fisherman too, he thought. The sanderlings ran along the water's edge, the pelicans dived for fish, and 3 vultures were fighting over the carcass of the little grebe. Tomas did not look at any of them. For the first time he was thinking seriously about his future. The oficiales had frightened him. They came from a world he did not know, and that was scary. He also did not know what high school would be like, but he did know about fishing, and he was thinking that he should begin his career right now with that shark. He took down from the palapa wall an enormous hook as big as a gas can and tied a long coil of nylon to it. Hanging them over his shoulder, he went out onto the reef. The tide was not quite at ebb, but the reef was well above water. There were many rocks available for use as winches. Stationing himself at the end of the reef and standing as motionless as an egret, he peered into the sea. There you are. The dark caudal fin of the shark cast a shadow across a garden of limpets and peanut worms going about their lives on the sea bottom. The shark's head was far under the overhang, in the sweeping current that was forcing water through its gills. Tomas could see the tip of the tail, but not the head and eyes. That was good, he said to himself. I can see the shark, but the shark can't see me. He strained to catch a glimpse of the yellow spots, but the sun was in his eyes. The angle of the sun's rays did, however, illuminate the back fin, and Tomas saw why the shark was hanging out in the swift waters along the reef. It was wounded. A great gash lay open from the base of its caudal fin to the first dorsal fin. Ramon said sharks were often cut by the propellers of boats and ships, especially the pleasant, docile sharks like the nurse and whale sharks. Some such accidents had happened to Tomas's shark, and that was good. My prize is weak, he thought. He'll be easier to take. He dropped the heavy hook and let it fall slowly until it was beside the huge tail. The whale shark was moving, but not very fast. Tomas walked along with him, jiggling the hook closer and closer to the grisly tail. When at last it was under it, Tomas yanked, felt the hook sink into the tough flesh, and whipped the line around a rock. It stretched taut, and as the shark streaked off into the glare of the sun, roiling the water, Tomas could see nothing but spray and light. Bracing his feet against another rock, he grabbed the line and pulled. The hook sank in deeper. Tomas had his shark at last.